Hey, this is Lindsay, and as promised, we're continuing down the route of going through and dissecting and breaking down the 2020 450 Shootout. As you can see behind me, we have the 2020 Kawasaki KX450. That's going to be the subject of this video. So if you haven't already, I released my 2020 450 Shootout video. It's about 13 minutes long. It breaks down the results of it, a little bit of the ins and outs of each bike, just kind of a broad overview to give you guys an idea of what we found over the 3 days of testing. But from there, I'm taking each bike into its own individual video. I'm going to spend a lot more time breaking down the characteristics of those bikes, the good, the bad, where the test riders agreed, where they disagreed, give you a little more insight on what each test rider thought. And then also taking maybe a few minutes to go through some of the changes we would recommend to that motorcycle if you still went out and got one. Because as I said at the start of my other shootout videos, and I always say is, hey, the winner of the shootout wins because it's a well-rounded machine, and it's definitely a bike that we all valued in the test because of its ease of setup, its broad characteristics that suited a range of riders. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the bike that you should go out and buy. It definitely has a good repertoire and it's a pretty safe bet, but at the same time, there's definitely characteristics about each motorcycle that stand out. And by going through and breaking it down this far, we want to give any consumer that's really interested in buying one of these bikes this year the opportunity to hear everything and find that bike that's going to suit them best. When they walk out of the showroom floor, they know exactly what the bike they're getting is going to do, what it's good at, maybe what it's not so good at, and what they can do to fix that, so they can find the bike that they think is going to be the best to suit their needs. Before we jump into this really quick though, I want to thank a couple of the brands that help make this thing happen. Shop Around Motorsports is where we got all these bikes. You can check out chatmoto.com if you need any parts, gear, accessories. Throw in the code ML512 at checkout to save yourself a few dollars on your next purchase. Big thanks to them for helping us set this all up and for me to be able to afford and get some of these bikes to be able to do this test, what I consider privately, being able to get all the bikes the same way as you, the consumer, does, going out and getting them off the dealership floor, breaking them in, etc. Beyond that, there's quite a few other brands that have helped make this thing happen, like Fox and Oakley, set up all of our guys head to toe and supported us. Big thanks to them. Some local companies, Epoxy at SoCal and DCMX Tools supported this. Check out description below. There's links to their Instagram and stuff. Please give them a follow, maybe a little bit of a shout out as a big thank you for helping support this and be able to pull this off. Also Vista Design for all the graphics, Works Connection for the stands, and then Dunlop for hooking us up with a big batch of MX33 tires. So we had fresh rubber on all these bikes for the testing, and an even comparison. We weren't gonna be able to get some of the OEM provided tires in this test, so by working with them, we got all the bikes on the same one. Was probably the most common tire out there, so it gives us the information that probably best relates to what riders would expect on them and just gives us an overall even playing field. So now jumping into this, the Kawasaki KX450 came up in 4th in this year's shootout. Oh, and one last thing, people wondering where the heck my hair went. Bad barbershop visit. Yeah. We're dealing with some pretty short stuff right now. It's going to be a while before that thing grows back, but oh well. Now let's talk about it. The Kawasaki KX450 got 4th place this year, 1 point behind the Husky in our final rankings. Our rankings are pretty simple to understand. Each rider scores the bikes 1 through 6. We add up their scores, the lowest score wins. In the case of the Cowie, ended up with 18 total points to the Husqvarna's 17. So like I said, got 4th by 1 point. Scoring was myself, Michael Lindsay, I rated the bike 2nd. Jeff Walker rated it 5th, Maddox Soda rated it 4th, Derek Caskey 3rd, and Zach Petty 4th. So we can see kind of a mid-pack finish for it, averaging around that 3rd, 4th spot. That's why it finished 4th place, just kind of up there in the running for right outside the podium spot. And first off, we're going to go over some of the broad characteristics of this bike, some of the things I think everybody agreed upon. So I'll give you guys a little bit of a short background. If you really want to learn more about what the changes are, this bike, like I said, the 20 is a BNG motorcycle. There was a ton of changes in 18. It was the biggest jump that Kawasaki had ever made with the bike since their 2008 to 2009 model change. I have a first look up on my page. You can go check that out for more of the details, but quick one. All new chassis, kind of a different architecture, the way they built it, especially the cradle area. Trying to get more of the comfort they had in some past chassis, try to get more front end feel than they've ever had, because the Cowie's known for that rear steer characteristic. Try to balance it out, get a little more of those front steering guys a little bit happier with this setup. The motor had quite a bit of changes, a new architecture as well. Lost some weight, went electric start only. Really tried to just expand upon what they already had in that department. Good low to mid character, try to get a little more top. Big suspension updates, back to spring fork in 19, all new bodywork, just pretty much an all new ground up bike for them. Very few parts actually carry over from a 2018 model. So starting off at the chassis. If you've watched my other videos, I made a big kind of compliment to the Yamaha about how much chassis comfort there is in that bike. I kind of raised, like, you have the Honda and the Suzuki definitely on the more rigid side. KTM and Husky fall somewhere in the middle, and then the Yamaha and the Kawi are definitely on the side that the chassis offers a lot of extra comfort into the riding. It doesn't just leave the suspension up to doing all the work. You can definitely feel a lot of harsh bump absorption, a lot of square edge absorption through the frame. But that also makes it interesting because a precise frame is going to also be, rigid frame is going to be very precise. So that's the challenge with this style setup, is getting all that comfort and that flex, but at the same time keeping the bike precise, being able to get certain feel out of it. And like I said, this is definitely a much more comfortable chassis than the 16 to 18 version, really good bump absorption. Definitely more of a front end feel than what they've had before. Not to say it has the turn in response of the Suzuki or the Honda. We're not going as far as saying it's that good. But it falls more in line with me, maybe like what the KTM and Husky have. Definitely good front end bite, good front end traction and feel. You can't just turn into the tightest sections. It doesn't cut across stuff as fast like it says in the Honda or Suzuki. It doesn't have that kind of constant front end weighted feel, but it'll definitely turn in across slicker conditions, rough conditions. You can get a certain amount of bite out of the front end, and what I feel like is good information to the rider to understand what the front end is doing, enough that you can trust in a lot of those situations. This complements what they still have as probably the best rear end steer bike in the class, and part of that comes from just how they've always focused their chassis development down to how the motor plays a part in that as well, which we'll get to in a second. So a really balanced out characteristic, more than what the Kawi's ever had before. Still not probably the bike for the person that is 100% focused on front end bite and traction. Maybe somebody that's looking more in the Suzuki area. I think the Kawi has a lot better corner entry when there's ruts and berms now, but still just turning in across flat, hard packed dirt, it doesn't quite get where the top one or two bikes in that category are. Moving to the suspension, this is the first major point of contention. There's a bit of a misbalance with it, and this is where the riders struggled last year, and it carries over into this year because they didn't make any changes. So the fork itself, architecturally, is almost identical to the fork found on the Honda or the Suzuki 450s. It is what everybody's calling the A-kit type fork. And where that comes from is a lot of the componentry is very similar to Showa's kit forks from the past couple years. We have a 49mm extension tube, this lower slider. That's when people say, oh, I got a 49mm fork. That's what we're talking about, lower tube size. The damping rod is 14mm, the cartridge is quite a bit bigger, and the damping rod piston, stuff that matches up with component sizes we've seen from kit forks before. I believe Showa actually calls this fork an A-01, I believe is the production name for it. But either way, similar architecture of those forks, even holds the same spring rate as what's on the Honda, the Suzuki, which is a 5.0 Newton meter, but it feels a lot softer, and part of that comes from, I think, the way the bike is balanced and a low fork oil volume. The Suzuki and Honda, I think, are around 350 cc's or so. This fork is only around 310 to 350 cc's, so that lack of oil volume, it gives up a lot of its speed sensitivity, and then the rear end's a little bit on the stiff side, so it overloads the front. So a lot of riders, they're on it, man, the fork comfort is really good on this bike initially. Small chop, small square edges, there's a lot of give in the fork. It's very plush initially feeling. It actually has a different internal surface treatment, this dimpling on the tube that neither of the other two brands that order the Showa components run on that. So they say that's a big claim, but I think part of it is the way it's set up. Just really good initial feel, a lot of comfort, really complements the chassis. But the problem is on the faster tracks with the more abrupt braking zones that had heavier loads, more abrupt jump faces, and just when you rode it overall more aggressively, the front didn't have a lot of hold up. It would blow through the stroke, and it was good on low speed chop, flowing into corners where you were just kind of rolling with your momentum. But as soon as you had to brake deep or jump into the face of something, the fork would just, that's it, right through the stroke. Just didn't have that hold up needed to be able to over jump things, to be aggressive over the front end. So it felt like a great bike to ride at like 85 to 90% of your capabilities, but to go into extra 10% start pushing, fork just wasn't there. And the hard part is because the spring rate is there and a lot of the value specs, like, okay, it's similar to those bikes, where is the problem coming from? Like I said, the oil volume's part of it. You can try to go stiffer on the clickers, which we did for multiple riders of different variances, but eventually you can only go so far and the fork just becomes harsh. So you start to give up that initial comfort, but you never get all the way of gaining the bottoming resistance. So you just kind of end up moving the window into the middle and you lose the initial, but you still don't gain the end stroke holdup that you need. Once you're up about 5-6 clicks stiffer, it's just giving it up at that point. Going a little bit faster on rebound helps a lot on the downhills, but on more hard pack tracks, it feels like it starts to top out in the stroke. I think another problem with that is also partially the shock overpowers the fork a little bit. I think it's a lack of leverage ratio and maybe a little bit too high spring rate for what the fork bounce is, but the rear end just seems to ride a little bit high on decel and through bumps, so it's putting a lot of weight on the front end. Personally, a lot of what we're opening the high-speed compression to get it to squat and stay down in the stroke, a little bit sore on rebound and maybe a little less sag. So if we're starting at a baseline of 105, this bike seemed to end up more in like the 107 range, just trying to keep that rear end down, try to keep some weight off the front end so it just doesn't dive so much. Because a few riders were commenting they thought maybe it had a lot of engine braking because it was just, as soon as you chop the throttle, you'd feel the bike pitch and change balance really quick because it would unload. If you came in and you went from full acceleration, chop throttle to braking really heavy, you'd feel the attitude of the bike adjust quickly, which makes it really hard to push when the bike is erratically changing its pitch. It's not as balanced as it should be. Going into the motor, it's very broad. It has a very crisp initial response. It feels very connected to the wrist. It's just every little motion you do with your hand, you feel the bike instantly respond. Not a snap that gets away from you, but you just feel like you can modulate that power really well. And like I said, it's pretty broad, definitely more towards the low to mid range, but has decent top. But overall, it just doesn't have a lot of output compared to a couple of the air bikes in the class. And that was the major complaint in the motor department is, hey, like the characteristic is really good. A lot of guys really thought the power characteristic, the connection, the mapping's good. It just needs a bit more, which yes, you can say, oh, 450s don't need any more. There are those certain situations where you can get the most out of the power. And like I said, what the Kali has going for it already is that it is so well mapped. It does have such a good power characteristic. It's pretty easy to manage. If we could keep that power characteristic and just raise the level of it, it would really satisfy more of the riders in the test. As for the ECU plugs, which we were able to change on the bike, the standard green coupler had that characteristic that we talked about. The black coupler, which is the smoother one, it gets rid of a little bit of the bark right off the bottom. It's a little bit easier to actuate in tight ruts or when it's slicker. It's still connected, just not as much of a sharp throttle response feel. So it mellows that out a little bit, and then I feel like it gains a little bit on top end because of it having a richer coupler, having a little more feel. It pulls a little bit better at high RPM and doesn't quite nose over as hard. And then the white coupler, which is more aggressive, accentuates that snap feel off the bottom. It revs a bit quicker, but once you get to the top of the RPM, it feels like it has a little bit more of a cliff it falls off of. I've personally played around with their little, I guess I call it the Game Boy, their accessory map tuner. We really didn't include anything based off those results in the test because that item does cost money from the dealership, where like Yamaha's Power Tuner app is free. The accessory map tuner for the Kawasaki costs a couple $100. I've done a map where I basically have combined the initial part of the black and kept the green ending. I really like that overall. But overall, these map changes are minor. They don't increase the overall output to the point that the riders needed to be happy or rank it a bit higher. The last point of contention that really stood out for everybody was the ergonomics of the machine. All the riders complimented the bodywork, the seat profile, and everything about the Kawasaki. There was no complaints about catching anywhere. The foot peg to seat height felt great, and of course it has the adjustable peg mounts to drop down for taller riders. All of this was good. Where the problem was related to the bars. And this sounds, of course, like nitpicking because naturally, hey, everybody's got a bar of choice. When you get the bike, if that's something that bothers you, switch. Well, there's plenty of other bikes in the Shootout that have a bar or a handlebar that's acceptable across a wide range of us. Maybe it's not our preference, but it gets the job done. In this case, the cockpit up in that area on this bike did it for nobody. Whether it's the smallest guy, Zach Petty at like 150 pounds, 5'7", to Jeff Walker and Derek Caskey, who are both 6'1", and Derek's 109 pounds, size XXL gloves, like just an overall, fairly broader guy. It just doesn't work. The bars are very tall, but they have a weird amount of sweep where they don't even work for tall guys. And for us little guys, you're saying it just makes you sit upright in the cockpit so bad when you're sitting. And when you're standing up, you have to stand very upright. It has your shoulders and elbows up too high. And for me, I ended up just having to roll the bars down to lap bars to make it work for me. And it was kind of hard because I would adjust them that much for like me and Zach Petty, and then the taller guys that get on the bike and they're trying to roll them up past the neutral point to try to get rid of some of the sweep feel in the bars so their elbows weren't pinched in. So honestly, no rider in the group liked the handlebars, and they said that really threw off the ergos because between the foot peg mount options and the handlebar, the actual top trip clamp holes move the bar mounts back and forth. It does have a good range of ergonomics for riders. I always see people, hey, what's the best tall guy's bike? What's the best small guy's bike? The Kawi does hit a perfect medium. You can really be on either end of the scale or in the middle and probably find something about this bike that'll ergonomically make you happy. But number one with that is ditching the stock bars. Another little nitpick, and I said this about last year's bike, it sounds like a small change, but I honestly think it makes a huge difference, is they went to a 250 millimeter rear rotor last year. I don't care for it. It takes so little pedal pressure to lock it. It's really hard to modulate. And that might sound like a weird complaint, but it kind of triggers weird things when you're riding. On West Coast, when you have hard pack ruts, it's so easy to drag that rear brake coming in that you end up sliding the rear tire up and over those shallow ruts that aren't deep enough to hold the bike in on entry. And then talking about that bike balance, struggling with the rear end lift character because of the lack of leverage. When you lock the rear tire that easy across braking bumps, it just unloads out of the stroke every time it clips one. So the race team doesn't even run the 250. They go back to a 240. I did personally on my 19 bike that I rode quite a bit last year. I put the 18 bracket carrier on it and threw a 240 rotor on it. And it really changed the character of the bike for me on corner entry, really improved that, settled down the rear end of the bike a bit. And definitely something I would recommend. So getting over into some of the individual thoughts on this bike. Like I said, I rated it second. A lot of the thoughts I've shared are based off mine and some of the comments that come in. As for other riders, we'll start with Jeff Walker. He rated the bike fifth. His good. The motor pulled really smooth, really broad characteristic, really crisp feel. He likes the adjustable ergonomics, like the lower pegs and the bar mounts up top for him. He said the hydraulic clutch was amazing, and that's a point I also missed is nobody seems to notice it has a hydro in a good way. It has the most cable-like distance of engagement and feel to the point there's very little adaptation period when you jump on this bike with that. The only negative I can say for the hydro is the engagement distance is a bit long, so it's got a lot of, the engagement distance long is good. It's the free play that's kind of excessive on it. I personally like a lot of free play in my clutch lever, but some people don't, and if you have big hands, you're probably going to crunch that lever in your fingers, so you're going to have to run the lever way adjusted out or put a spacer. I've seen a few guys put a spacer in the actual caliper mount itself to move the entire assembly farther out from the bars. That would be something to kind of think about because definitely the lever will come in and get to your fingers if you have a larger hand size. Other goods from Walker, like I said, roomy cockpit for the tall guys. The bad, super soft suspension, especially the front end forks or front forks for him. Once again, he's the fastest guy in this test, kind of middle to the higher end weight scale. I know he really struggled the second day of Fox Raceway with the more abrupt jumps, the more abrupt braking zones. We couldn't get the forks stiff enough without losing comfort and balance out the bike for him. Once again, even at his height, the awkward tall bars. Talking about that sweep, it just didn't work in a sense, even for any range of the guys. Because we were trying to run it low in the rear to balance it out, he said our acceleration kind of had a choppered out feel. Not necessarily a very fast motor. Once again, broad, but just not a ton of output. And then for him, his speed and skill level, like I said, a problem that can come up with having the chassis that's soft and the suspension that's soft kind of feels wallowy boat-like. If you listen to my Yamaha comments, I talk a lot about how they've gone for chassis comfort, but they've tried to match that by making the suspension more aggressive and held up in the stroke. Well, soft as the front end is here and as much flex as there is in the chassis, you end up with a bike that under extreme braking, extreme aggression over the front end just starts to wallow around and feel loose, and it can get kind of vague, and that definitely came up for Jeff. Zach Petty is my other pro level rider in this group. He is the smallest though, like 5'7", 5'8", 150 pounds, has raced a little bit of Supercross, a little bit of Nationals, really overall balanced rider, very technically proficient on the bike. Zach rated the bike fourth. Pros, really liked the seat height, the foot peg position, all the body work it didn't catch, all that stuff he was really happy with. The slenderness at the foot pegs, the grip of the bike. The bars were all right for him. Front brake was strong. Felt like the rear brake was easy to lock. Couldn't really deal with the pedal modulation very well. Bike rolls side to side through sweepers really well. Basically transitions its weight. Cons, suspension was balanced. if his speed was lower. Basically, he felt like if he was riding like 80 to 90%, the bike was good, but pushing, he just felt that same thing. The pitching of the bike and the front was too soft. He tried to go a lot faster on rebound, which helped on the fork, but he could only go so stiff on compression without losing the comfort. Same thing. He said after 3 clicks, he would just lose too much comfort to be worth the change. He said the motor was really good in 3rd and 4th gear. 2nd to 3rd were almost a little too similar. Strong pull off the bottom, good response, signed off a little quickly up top, and just overall need a little bit more output. Definitely say felt like he shifted this bike a little more than some of the others in the class. So my biggest guy in the group, Derek Caskey, 190 pounds. He's your vet, like 40 plus novice guy, 6'1", just an overall broad built guy. He rated the Kawasaki 3rd. His comments, really liked the chassis feel, the adjustability, and the overall comfort by the chassis. He really liked, of course, being able to be that much taller, being able to drop the foot pegs was a huge bonus for him. The suspension was overall decent for him, but the forks felt quite soft. Once again, the range of adjustment was only so far before the comfort was lost. I said motor was broad, connected, good mapping. Didn't feel as fast as last year. And it's funny, is Derek's somebody that participated in last year's shootout with me, same with Zach. I do agree with both of them. This is, I guess, you know, the little bit of variance you get in production bikes, but I definitely felt like our 19 we had last year had a little bit overall more everywhere. I don't know if I just got a slightly less pick of the litter, but I would say the bike we had last year felt just a tad bit better, and I had a couple of my other test riders kind of throw out that sentiment as well as we went through this. Big one for him though was same with Derek, same problem as there is the bar bend just didn't work for him. Really needs stiffer fork springs at his weight by quite a bit. Also talking about, I kind of miss with the other guys what everybody's riding. Myself, I ride a little bit of everything. I don't really have, I bought a Kawasaki 450 to ride a little bit last year when I quit my last media job. But I test and ride a mix of everything at a fairly even amount. Derek personally owns a Honda. Jeff Walker races Hondas right now. I did race a Husky a little bit earlier this year. Zach Petty was on Yamahas the last couple years and has been on a Honda 450 this past year. For anybody points too many fingers, the 3 guys that own Honda, only one of them actually picked the Honda for the win. So like I said, if you haven't checked out the main shootout video, check that out. It's kind of interesting. And then my other kid's coming up here, Maddox Soto. He is like my typical, he's my local B kid, top 5 local B rider, about 5'10", high 160 pound range. He currently rides Suzuki's and he also rated the bike 4th. So his pros with the bike, really like the overall turning of the bike, basically the balance characteristic between front and rear steer. Really felt like you could use a wide range of line selections. Like the overall chassis comfort. The con for him, he felt like the engine braking was a little bit too much at high RPMs. He felt that pitch of the chassis. So like I said, I felt like the engine on this bike is fairly free compared to most of the class, but there is a lot of pitch when you transfer off decel, so it can give it that feel. But also Soto runs, I think, the bike to the full rev range pretty far, so he might have felt a little more. I think almost any 450 outside of Honda's a little bit free, and so is the Yamaha, but a lot of them would do better still with less decel. I mean, no bike takes the Suzuki in that sense. The Suzuki by far has the most high RPM decel feel. If you chop the throttle, you feel the front end load up on a lot on that bike, and it tries to transfer its weight. It's got that old school 4-stroke feel. I think the Kawi lands a little bit in the middle, but definitely the balance of the bike doesn't help its, or lack of balance doesn't really help its course there. So that runs through all those. We're gonna talk a little bit about what I would do to kind of upgrade the bike if you are interested in it. Easy one. We're talking about power output, just needing a little bit more. Pipes are a big help on this. Usually most 4-strokes, current day 4-strokes, it's hard to say that aftermarket pipes are big gains. They usually aren't. The stock exhausts have gone quite a bit better. The Kawi still has a decent amount of room. I'm sure somebody will bug me in the comment section. I actually did a full range of tests on the 19s and I said I'd post it and I got busy with this. So I'll try to get it up after this. I went through pretty much the majority of what's available, the FMF, PC, Yosh, Akrapovic. So I'll get some tests up on those, but what I'll tell you is anything that keeps the long header profile, the stock I preferred, keeps that really crisp initial low to mid, and the cans, it's pretty easy to get top end gains out of it. If you go to a pipe that has a shorter header, you're gonna lose bottom end. You're gonna gain quite a bit more mid to top. There's definitely some easy horsepower gain there. Maybe a high compression piston, just try to keep the overall character, but just get a little boost out of that. The mapping is really good out of box. One of the few bikes I can say you don't have to go, like a big improvement isn't going and chasing a different ECU for it. Other upgrades, like I said, drop the rear brake rotor down. Long link arms seem to help. Mostly it just moves, you know, the leverage curve a little bit far, or moves the leverage a little farther into its curve, trying to get a little more initial leverage. I would also run the rear wheel as far back as you can. Kawas have always liked that feel. Really helps with the rear end feel. It's kind of set in the middle stock, so definitely add a link. I would consider going up a tooth because, like I said, the bike was being shifted a little bit more. I felt like it couldn't roll through a corner in third gear as easy as like the Yamaha or the Honda could. Going up a tooth for me just kind of places in the right spot for the majority of bigger tracks. I think on a lot of tighter tracks, it's still maybe not enough, so the stock gearing's fine just going back to second. I would recommend though playing around with the gearing. It's got 50 stock, 51 to me was quite preferred. As we talk about bars, absolutely got to change the bars. And then onto suspension. So a lot of guys always say, oh, just throw a stiffer spring rate in it. As I said, the spring rates are already pretty close to the Honda, or right there with the Honda Suzuki. I don't actually think a fork spring is always the exact answer depending upon your rider weight and skill. I think if you're 165 more that 170 and a little bit above, I would recommend throwing a 5.2 Newton on one of the fork legs, but I would still up the oil volume by 15 cc's or so to try to get more speed sensitivity out of the fork. Once you're 180, I would say 185 and above, I would recommend 5.2s on both sides. Now, if you're 165 and below, like a couple of us were in the test, I would actually recommend dropping the shock spring rate to balance out the bike a little more, and then add the fork oil volume to get more speed sensitivity out of fork, because I think the spring rate's actually decent on the fork for more that lighter level rider. It's mostly the rear that I feel like overpowers it for most of us in that range. I mean, that really kind of does it for this bike. I feel like that covers quite a bit of our experiences with it. If you want to know anything else, throw the comment in the section below. I'll gladly answer them all. If you like what we're doing with all these shootouts, going out and getting all bikes, I want to do this again for $250. It's honestly not cheap to do though. No matter how many side contracts I work out to who's buying some of my bikes, who isn't, and stuff like that, who's, you know, purchasing them from me, it still costs a decent amount of money to go out, procure the bikes, do all the videos, all the test stuff. I have a Patreon now. It's description link below, patreon.com/ML512. I'm giving away a bunch of contest prizes if you want to throw a couple bucks in. Awesome. If you can't support that, I understand. Just give us a subscribe, hit the little bell notification, throw a like on the video. That does a lot as well for getting these videos out there more and expanding the presence on YouTube and just trying to grow the audience and get this out to a further amount of viewers that can hopefully do some good with this information. Make sure you check out the rest of the individual videos from the shootout if you're interested in some of those bikes. Please give them a watch, and thanks for viewing with us.